For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jillian Code. I am a co-director of the Technology Integration and Evaluation Research Lab with Drs. Valerie Irvin and Alison Hadwin. And it's our great pleasure today, along with the Learning and Teaching Center, to bring you Dr. John Willinsky. I'll let him introduce himself, but he is going to be talking about the intellectual properties of learning and the changing political economy of technology in Canada. We are going to be live streaming this event as well, so you will be broadcast. And if you'd like to follow along on Twitter, for those of you who are online, we are under the hashtag TIETalk. So without further ado, John?
Okay, Jillian, thanks so much. And Valerie, thank you very much for having me. Valerie approached me a few months ago. I was giving a talk in Vancouver, open education talk, and so she said, well, why don't you come over to Victoria? And I didn't hesitate, I hope you noticed that, because I completely forgot about the flight. There's something about the body. One of the great gifts of the body is that it puts away certain memories and sets them apart. And pain, I think, and nausea must be one of those that it sets apart. And so because I have made that flight many, many times over the 20 years I was at University of British Columbia, and I had completely forgotten. So I speak to you this morning on an upset stomach, as it were. And I've noticed coming in the car that I was I was almost punch drunk, slashing colleagues and reminiscing recklessly. So if I say anything untoward, well, actually, it is quite public, isn't it? So I'll count on you, Debbie, to kind of pull at your ear or something when I start wandering off. What I want to talk about is intellectual property. And I want to talk about its educational importance. I want to talk about it, a change of heart and mind that I've had about it, a certain responsibility or irresponsibility that I've shown towards intellectual property. I want to try to convince you of its importance and of how it is a huge gap in our current educational program, our failure to address it. And I want to do it in a Canadian context and in a slightly American context. And Julian said that I should introduce myself. Who better? And so I'm John Willinsky. And I am a professor. I'm a Canadian. Let me start with my roots here. Born and bred and educated. But for the last 5 years, I've been at Stanford University in Silicon Valley. And this is clearly an important thing to understand because it has affected my ideas about intellectual property greatly. It's the first time I've taught outside of a public institution at Stanford. First time, and I say that as someone who was educated in public schools, went to public schools in higher education, from Algoma University to Dalhousie University, my degrees, and who taught in public schools in Northern Ontario and in universities, public universities at Calgary and UBC. It's more introduction than you probably expected. And so it was a kind of rude awakening when I went to Stanford, beautifully timed in terms of buying a house and having the stock market completely collapse and the housing market collapse. Otherwise, I probably would have been back by now. And to understand the relationship of a private university in terms of its public responsibility. So that will come up. And intellectual property brings it to a head for me. But I need to share with you what happened after I gave my talk on Wednesday morning. Wednesday, time kind of, I'm still trying to get up my feet on the ground here. If my feet leave the ground, do let me know, okay? Because I'm just feeling that. And I may have to lie down, actually, for a moment, recover. I'm sure you've all made the flight and this doesn't happen to you. So at the end of my talk on Wednesday to the Open Education group, very enthusiastic, crazy, wild group, Open Education, there wasn't a lap that didn't have a top on it. They were blogging and just so active. And I took the whole talk to be an occasion to see if I could get them to look up. It happened, actually, at minute 22. When I fell off the stage, everybody looked, no. They did look up. But at the end of the talk, John Maxwell came up to me, who'd actually been a student of mine many years ago, and said, why are you talking about property? Why are you calling this property? No one needs to think about this as property. These are ideas. This is culture. This is it's not, why aren't you past property? And I wanted to be very defensive, but I was very gracious and said, that's a very interesting idea. And I do want to consider that for a moment, because there is a whole generation that isn't thinking about it so much as property. I'm sorry, I'm leaving you out of the speech here. That property it's controversial. So I want to say that it seems to me irresponsible, and I didn't say this to John, although he may be watching. I want to say that to me it is irresponsible to send children or adults out into the world today without a sense of intellectual property, that it governs this economy, that it's the base of a knowledge economy, an information economy. And on the other side, from something closer to the work that Debbie Bagori and I have shared in literacy, it is what gives value, legal, economic, political, and historical value to the words that children and adults, authors, and students write and compose. And it is a measure that we somehow have not been taking track of. And so I want to talk about intellectual property as a concept, as a historical concept. And I want to describe to you, excellent idea. I want to describe to you a project I'm working on, but I really want to talk about the Canadian developments in Canada, in this country, in the last 4 or 5 months even. Supreme Court decisions that are changing the nature of intellectual property in this country. And to say that it's such an exciting time in terms of Canada's approach to intellectual property for educators. And that what has been happening is something that I think we need to introduce into our curriculum for the preparation of teachers, in the Faculty of Education, and for the university among the students. So let me set this up a little bit in terms of intellectual property and why I'm focusing on it. My work at UBC and at Stanford, and now I have a part-time position also at Simon Fraser University, where I work with what's called the Public Knowledge Project. For 12 or 14 years, I guess 14 years now, the Public Knowledge Project has been dedicated as a group of scholars and librarians with a number of colleagues. Ray Siemens here at UVic has been one of our staunchest allies and partner in this. We've been concerned about increasing the public value of research and scholarship. And when I say public value, accessibility is one element, the very availability of it, the material right, if you like, to look at research and scholarship as a member of the public is a highly contested area. And I called it the Public Knowledge Project in 1998 because project, you know, like how long will it take to convince people this is the right thing to do? How long will it take to say to my colleagues, Ted, we need to make our knowledge, the research that we do for the schools, we need to make it publicly available. And I only said that because I hadn't realized, I hadn't thought about it before as not being available until I did an experiment with the Vancouver Sun, where we were going to make the research available for a series of articles that they were making available, that they were writing, in the Vancouver Sun. I was the Pacific Press professor of literacy and technology at that time. Pacific Press, that wonderful democratic enterprise in Vancouver that owns both the newspapers, always best for democracy if one company owns both of the major newspapers in a town. And actually the joke I made the other day, and I know this is being webcast, so this is so redundant, but I have to note, someone noted that David Radler, who was the owner of Vancouver Sun, Pacific Press at that time, who I approached to raise additional funds and who said no, he's now out of prison. So, tit for tat. In that experiment, as I have said before in the past, I need to note, what happened was that the newspapers were totally cooperative with the idea of bringing research and journalism together. And I went into that with my graduate students headlong and came up embarrassed, shamefaced, because I couldn't share the research with the public. I could put abstracts, titles, links, They didn't even have credit card in 1998. You couldn't do like a credit card, get an article access. There was just no access allowed. And so since that time, we've been very committed and devoted to sharing this work. And in that time, so let me bring you up to date a bit on that. The movement that took place, this 1998, by 2001, there was a movement to put research and scholarship online, and online on a publicly available basis. And that movement was called Open Access, the Open Access movement, corresponding to the open source software movement that brings you the Mozilla Foundation, Firefox, that brings you many things that you take for granted but are open source software. Linux, Google runs on Linux, for example, even though Google itself is obviously not open source. But Google does Android as an open source software system that many of you are using on your phones. So that correspondence between open source software, where the principle was the means of communication should be held by the public. The very basis of how we connect should be a public utility. Shouldn't be held in corporate hands. And that principle we were trying to bring to research and scholarship. So how far have we got just let me bring you very briefly up to date in the 14 years that I've been working on this, and others certainly started before me. Stephen Harnard at the University of Quebec at Montreal was an early trendsetter in this area. So we now can say that about 21 to 23% of everything that is published this year will end up freely available to the public by a number of means, which I'll describe to you again briefly. So 23% of the literature. So if you go as a concerned parent with a sick child and you look at the medical research in PubMed, your chances are roughly 1 in 5 of finding an article you can actually share with your doctor. Similarly with the doctor. The doctor's chances of finding an article, if the doctor's not part of a university hospital system, the doctor's chances of finding an article, or the teacher's chances of finding an article that pertain to the work that she's doing with her students, or any of the policymakers down the street in the province's capital, the chances of them finding the latest work in agriculture, in economics, forestry, tourism, the chances are roughly 1 in 5 of finding the research that's been taxpayer financed, that's been published by the universities. And so that open access success at this point has been relatively limited. And yet the federal government is on board in principle. SSHRC, NSERC, CIHR are all in principle behind open access. SSHRC funds open access journals, journals that publish with all of their content freely available. CIHR, which is the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, which is the largest funder of biomedical research in this country, CIHR requires, by law, 12 months after, if you've received money, let's put that condition at the front, once you've received that money from CIHR, and you publish an article from that research, within 12 months you need to make that article freely available. The final draft, there are all kinds of little technicalities to appease the publishers, but there is a spirit afoot. And if I was here for another purpose, I would be cajoling you into thinking about a policy for this institution or for this faculty of education. We have one at Stanford. We're deeply committed. We're not very active on this, but we're deeply committed. We voted unanimously that everything we do, a final draft, that is the one before the publisher, before we sign the contract with the publisher, that final draft that's still ours and we control, we put a Creative Commons license on it and we share that with the public as a policy. Some publishers have said no. If they say no, then we don't make it publicly available. We waive the policy. But in 2008, so 4 years, I've had 2 cases, 2 clear-cut cases, a few are equivocal, where the publishers said no. Otherwise, we've had publishers change their policies because of this, at least in principle. They have. So this open access movement is for me an important element of creating a public education system that extends beyond the schools. A public education system that says the democratic quality of this country is dependent upon the educational quality of our civil lives, the availability of Canada's research. Canada is a leader in a number of fields in terms of publications. There's a government report recently out that's very interesting. Education is not, but in psychology, a very closely related field, Canada is one of the leaders. In visual arts, scholarship on visual arts, Canada is one of the leaders. And I would like to see more of Canada's research available to Canadians. No, really, that's not right. It should be available to the world. And so that's what this is about. So intellectual property has become for me the focus point of that. Why is that? What is the importance here? Because intellectual property is the battleground. Intellectual property is the point of confusion. Somehow, research and scholarship has fallen under the same intellectual property regime as Justin Bieber lives under. And I think there's something wrong with that picture. It's not resentment about hair. Now, don't even think that for a minute. I'm way past that. I just think there are distinctions to be made around intellectual property that are not being made today. And I want to suggest to you that these distinctions are changing, and that we need to change with them, and that we need to help raise the expectations that these changes are moving in the right direction. We need to speak to our students and our student teachers about the importance of the educational quality of this society and the degree to which it depends on the availability of research and scholarship to everybody. We have public libraries. God bless them. We have public libraries, but those public libraries cannot access this research and scholarship at this point. Well, sorry, they could access 23%, 22% of this research on a relatively random basis on the commitment of faculty members to publish in open access journals, of which there are at least 8,000. I'm thinking more like 10 to 12,000 open access journals. And then the policies of publishers, I should just go back into this for 1 second. The policies of publishers is to allow faculty to post. When we had our policy at Stanford, all of the big publishers said yes. Elsevier, Taylor and Francis, Springer, all said no problem. Some societies, American Educational Research Association, my own association, has had problems with it. But the big publishers say, fine, knock yourself out. And the effect, of course, has been that most faculty members don't bother. The effect has been they haven't risen to the expectations. Let's deal with intellectual property. So intellectual property, and what I want to suggest to you today, is a distinction between the intellectual properties of learning and the intellectual property of Justin Bieber, Margaret Atwood, Alice Munro. Let's raise the bar a little bit here. Leonard Cohen. Let's up it a bit, and it's not fair to Justin. This distinction has a grounding in law, in economics, in history. And I'll just briefly introduce the project that I'm working on, but I want to really deal with the constitutional cases from this summer as kind of the focal point of this, what I think is a major change in the direction for Canada. But the project for me around intellectual property was trying to understand how it is that I might expect that research and scholarship should have a different status, a different legal position. And that wasn't hard to begin to find, because that status is already part of Canadian law. I'm going to be talking a lot about fair dealing. Let me just deal with that for 1 second. Fair dealing in Canada applies to copyright law, it's part of copyright law, excuse me, and provides an exception to copyright law. Copyright law in Canada is an odd law in that it applies automatically. Patents, you have to go through an application process. People making notes, yes, in paper, on pencil, nice. So unless you're copying my exact words down, are you? Okay, good. No problem. I'm good. I'm down with that. It's okay. But that's already that's copyrighted. That's yours. You can now, that's protected automatically, okay? So it's a law that is kind of overextended. Everything our students do, if it's not a direct transcript. Even a translation has a kind of special status, but even then, a translation we have some control over as the author. It has copyright protection with this exception called fair dealing. And what's important to understand about fair dealing is copyright is not about ownership. Copyright is about fair dealing. Now, Canada has very prosaic copyright acts, each of which is named Copyright Act 1 point whatever. But in the United States and in England, let me deal with the UK at the beginning. The history of copyright is said to begin, without the word copyright, with the Statute of Anne in 1710. In 1710, the Statute of Anne is called an act to make publishers rich beyond their wildest dreams in destroying the hopes of authors to find a living. No, sorry, wrong act. Wrong act, sorry. It's called an act for the encouragement of learning. Could we ask for anything better than that? A silver platter from Queen Anne. An act for the encouragement of learning. This was the first act, not for licensing books. The king and the church had been licensing books for a century and a half before that. This was the first act that provided the author a claim on their work, that ensured that the author had rights over their work for a period of time, all of 14 years. But the principle for granting this right was to encourage learning. It was to encourage learning not for the benefit of the learned, but for the benefit of society. So that learned men, and it was that phrase, and it was limited in that way, learned men would have a reason to contribute. Piracy was a huge issue. There were whole sides of churches that had these big broadsheets that said rip, burn, and sorry? Destroy? Yeah, no, there's an Apple expression from a few years ago. You were too young. But it was a time when Apple was encouraging people to rip and burn things from 18th century. Remix, thank you, yes. Rip, burn, remix, good. That Ted's always on top of the culture. So this idea that an act to encourage learning, in the United States, the Constitution, the United States Constitution has a clause for the progress of the useful sciences and arts, not for the wealth of publishers or authors, but for the progress of the useful sciences and arts. Congress can make laws for limited times that will grant a monopoly. So the weird thing about copyright is it is an unnatural act of capitalism, a monopoly. It's granted for the benefit of society to encourage people to produce and contribute culture. And it began with the notion of learning. The first act in 1710, an act for the encouragement of learning, mentions the universities multiple times and sets the universities apart from the rest of the economy. Because one of the clauses says a copy of every book that is published in the kingdom. Why didn't they say queendom? But at any rate, in the kingdom, I'll check that later. In the kingdom, every book published in the kingdom, one copy had to be deposited in the public library of Oxford and Cambridge. With a K, public. Do you see how that says that the library has a social good? The library is part of a society that is separate from this commercial economy, and that the benefit needed to be protected for the encouragement of learning, and that every book deposited in that library would lead to further learning in a way that benefited this society. Queen Anne went further than that. She said that the chancellor of the university could call up any publisher, demand that they appear in the chancellor's office. I might be exaggerating a little bit here. But the gist of it was that anything that was felt to be charged, any book that was felt to have too high a charge on it could be challenged, and that the price needed to be reset if the chancellor felt that the book was being overcharged. Now, can you imagine today? In fact, I don't think that's been rescinded in the UK, and I'm not sure why it hasn't been used more vociferously as a... But at any rate, the principle we want to take forward is that intellectual property began with this very notion of benefit, and we've lost sight of it. And it still exists today in Canada under the Fair Dealing Clause, which is what I want to get to. But what's important to see is the distinctions I'm calling for are distinctions that already exist in law. Already acknowledge a separate economy for learning. Already see that the benefit of learning is a social good, not a private good, not an individual development, I got the best scores anyone has ever got, good. Not a gain in individual scores through high-stakes testing, good, but a social and public good. And so this project, and thinking about the intellectual property distinction that's been lost, and thinking about how we can provide a stronger historical, economic, and legal claim for why there should be open access to research and scholarship, why educational technology is partly an instrument of that, why I'm, in fact, here before you in terms of educational technology, because of how it enables a whole new degree in the circulation of knowledge and a whole new facility, or affordances, as we tend to say, is based on this idea that these distinctions have a long history. Now, the project led me to think about John Locke. And this partly came from my move to the United States. Just very, very, again, this is really a sidelight to the thrust in terms of the Canadian context. But Locke and America have this kind of relationship, right? That people, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Locke's phrase actually was life, liberty, and estates. I know, and Jefferson had a focus group ran through it. They chose Pursuit of Happiness because there was a band named after it and because they felt more comfortable with it and it seemed more American. And so they went, and Locke uses the phrase Pursuit of Happiness in the essay concerning human understanding, but he never used actually life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in the same clause. He used life, liberty, and estates because he felt that that was property. And Locke made a lot of important distinctions about property. I have to say this. He started off, in terms of principles of property, by saying all the world is held in common. That the natural state of the world is all property is held in common. Now you have at this institution one of the leading Locke scholars on this very issue, James Tully, who has, I would say, very bravely fought the case, particularly around Indigenous and Aboriginal issues, around the consequences of Locke's theory. But within that notion of the world held in common as the natural state, and that any kind of restriction, any kind of enclosure, any kind of privatization has to be justified as having a social good. And that first property that Locke identifies is our bodies ourselves. That we own our own body. I hope some of you recognize that phrase, our bodies ourselves, because the Boston Women's Cooperative used that phrase, not from Locke, used that phrase in 1972, I'm guessing, to essentially launch the women's health movement, the feminist approach. And it's still going strong. But that idea of self-possession that was critical to Locke became critical in many different ways, well beyond what he foresaw, and well beyond his own implications in terms of African slavery and other unseemly tragedies. So Locke's theory of property has become important because his work is still being used to fight intellectual property battles. Locke has this amazing resilience in a small chapter of property, all of maybe 26 paragraphs, to be repeatedly cited, including by the Supreme Court in the United States, as a touchstone for property. And so I worked with that, and I'm still working with that. to try to explain how within Locke's theory of privatization of property against a commons, how that commons can still exist today. It exists in the University of Victoria's library. It's public library with a K on the end. Even though UBC proudly says it's the deposit library of the province of British Columbia, we all know that UVic has a library that's just as public in that regard. And so this idea that we have to justify, and just one more step in this journey, Locke is all in theory. He describes the world from the very beginning when the world was held in common and talks about the increasing levels of privatization, including the introduction of money. And within that, I want to show that the logic of Locke, the logic that Locke uses for the justification of privatization, applies to a separate domain where all of the property remains in common. You take a book out of the library and you privatize it for a period of time, but then you go back to the library and you return the book. I hope you do. You return the book on time, and you provide something else, additional scholarship, more commentary, further publications. And where do they go? Into the library. And the commons is enriched by it being in common. And the library provides, the university library in particular, provides that generative starting point that still exists today, separate from that other economy, except in the purchasing office of the library, except in the economy where the two economies meet, in the extreme cost of journals, for example. So, with Locke as part of my argument, I fell into medieval monasticism. I got swept up in 8 centuries of monks and nuns. First of all, the gender equality was so much better in terms of my favorite of the double monasteries, male monks and nuns run by an abbess, by a nun, and in which the monks and nuns would be kept entirely separate, except for the composition of texts. The scriptorium might be a common meeting ground for them. And there's a lovely kind of pastoral sense. But what was important to me about the monasteries is they weren't in theory, they were in practice. The monasteries were where intellectual property as a concept took shape, against an anti-intellectualism that Max Weber famously identified in Christianity, early Christianity. The monasteries were not a place for intellectual activity. They were a place of worship and piety and fidelity. They were a place of reverence and memorization of texts to such a degree that the monks and nuns spent hours and hours reading Scripture. The church fathers, Augustine, Jerome, Ambrose. And in that time of spending hours and hours as they sat there in front of a handwritten manuscript that they might have just completed themselves with their pen in their hand, they started to make marginal notes, glosses, about contradictions in Scripture, about the sources, about the New Testament's relationship to the Old Testament, as the Old Testament is thought to prophesize the coming of Christ. And all of that kind of marginal commentary had to prove itself because the borders, the sins of blasphemy were so easy to cross, and pride and hubris were so easy to trip into, that intellectual activity had to prove itself in a way that was contrary to the spirit of the monasteries, but yet established its social value, so that the learning that took place in the monasteries was allowed only insofar as it contributed to the learning of others. And the principle here of learning as something that contributes to others, particularly the learning of others, is an important intellectual principle that sets this property, because it was treated as property. Those illuminated manuscripts, of course, we revere them today because of their beauty, but the respect that each copyist paid to the text, the arguments they had about the intellectual property in terms of its origins, its spelling, its use of punctuation, its ability to incorporate commentary, its ability to educate and illuminate ideas. All of that created a sense of these properties as having a value in a community that had no property. Benedictine monasteries dominated this period of the 4th century to the 12th century that I'm talking about before the universities. Benedict's rule, the rule of St. Benedict, talks about neither a pen nor a book should any monk own. The very two items that are so crucial to this. And this idea that all of this property, all of this intellectual property grew up in an atmosphere, in a climate of communal sharing of property. And these books circulated. They were loaned and copied and filled monasteries. And that was necessary for the preservation of this intellectual capital, if you like. There were difficulties around Latin and Greek. In fact, Greek almost disappeared in terms of the Latin West, but the Latin texts were, unfortunately, written by pagans, Plato, Aristotle, pre-Christian. And the whole accommodation of Aristotle particularly, but Plato as well, into Christianity was part of an intellectual act, was part of a very fine line between blasphemy. Cicero, Jerome has this terrible dream about getting to heaven and saying, I'm here as a Christian, I'm so grateful and glad. And he's accused in this dream of being a Ciceronian because he had such respect for Cicero, pagan, Roman. And it put a chill, an intellectual chill on the entire monastic community for centuries. Until again, there was kind of a justification to show that, in fact, Cicero's way of phrasing things was so persuasive, you could turn a heathen into a Christian by using his very techniques of rhetoric. And therefore, let's have a little Cicero. What's the harm? He'll just make us better. So this idea of learning as it contributes to the learning of others is an important intellectual property distinction. That is the intellectual property of intellectual property. You'll notice, well, maybe you didn't, I'm using properties in my title. I'm watching. Some of you are following the slides as I go in kind of a nervous habit. The intellectual properties for me is this lovely notion of teasing out, and this is partly a Justin thing, I guess. That's the intellectual properties of Justin Bieber's songs and versus the intellectual properties of Cicero, and as we've been talking about here. The intellectual properties and these qualities have to do with the communication of ideas, have to do with what I want to call learning. And so part of my emphasis in this whole approach as an educator, as a professor of education, is to think about learning again. That learning has been lost to us as a concept. That learning is about children doing well on test scores. And it breaks what we do as scholars. The original sense. Remember that act from 1710? Has anyone remember it? An act for the encouragement of high test scores? No, an act for the encouragement of educational programs in schools that are well funded. An act for teachers getting the right support from this provincial government over the next 10 years. No, an act for the encouragement of learning. And seeing that common bond between what a child acquires in the first grade and what a doctoral student produces as their qualifying paper, as learning. And to see that learning element, that the properties of learning are at the forefront of what we're concerned about, of what we're thinking about, and in a faculty of education or in this university as a whole. So let me move this now. Let me jump from the monasteries and John Locke and talk about the Supreme Court of Canada and talk about changes in Canadian law. Let me go back to fair dealing. Do you remember that parenthetical? Everything's been parenthetical to my previous reference to fair dealing, just one extended footnote. An introduction, I'll now begin my talk. Fair dealing in Canada is an exception to copyright. Fair dealing in Canada establishes the balance between readers' rights and authors' rights, between publishers' rights and the learner's rights. Fair dealing in Canada has been changing. The phrase in the United States, by the way, is fair use. And I've played with this many times, and I don't really have a good explanation between them. Fair dealing, fair use. I don't even have a sense of the consequences of calling it dealing versus use. Because except in the dealing has a kind of nice distribution sense. I suppose, and the use is kind of more like just grab it and use it. And dealing suggests the kind of transaction where use just suggests the act itself. I suppose all of that might apply. But they're very similar in their wording, with a few very nice strategic differences between them in Canada and the United States. And in fact, the entire world have, where copyright holds, they all have some clause, far more frequently called fair use than fair dealing is the UK and Canada, essentially. And I guess that's where we inherited it from, obviously. So fair dealing says that under certain circumstances, copyright does not pertain, does not hold. And the most important change in the new act in this country that was passed last June, the new revisions of the Copyright Act, passed last June and enacted in September, whatever the final formal step was, I've forgotten the technical name for that. In it, two changes were made in fair dealing. One was, these are exceptions to infringement. That's a better term. Exceptions to infringement. So this prevents you from being accused of infringing on someone's copyright if it falls under fair dealing. And those have always been, historically, research or private study, criticism or review, and news reporting. Can you see the foundational aspect of that for democracy? News reporting, which is a book review. You can quote in a book review. That's the criticism, excuse me, or review. News reporting, the ability to take down others' words and not have to worry about copyright, whether it's the premier of this province or whether it's Margaret Atwood giving a speech. Research or private study. Now this is an interesting one. The private study one is a very controversial one, but it changed this summer. The research one says that if you're doing research, you cannot be accused of infringing on copyright. Now the very basic practical aspect of this is the photocopier in the library. The photocopier in the library is considered a machine for private study and research. And that was a very, very important breakthrough because libraries have restricted hours. And I think about even in our teaching, in our experience in the schools, let me just go back to that for a second. Let's tie this into the schools, because the schools and the private study are a controversial element. The schools and research are a controversial element. Now, I remember in my teaching career, as a school teacher of a decade's worth of teaching, I remember we started with spirit duplicators. They weren't called spirit duplicators for nothing. What it was like on Monday morning to hand out a worksheet and have an entire class in a single motion, like a wave. Thank you, they would say to me, as I handed out the spirit duplicated copies in purple. The first study that came out bore on the spirit duplicated that I read as a school teacher was the one that said purple against white is one of the most illegible, challenging reading environments imaginable, and that any other color would have done a better job. The Spirit Addiction Council, no, I'm kidding. That didn't get very far. Photocopiers were introduced into my school. So in probably about my 6th or 7th year of teaching, I don't want to date myself here too badly, but this must have been in probably 78 or 9. We first got our photocopier in the school. And remember, spirit duplicating in newspapers, there was a way. There was a Zen master in the whole city I worked in who could take any newspaper article and turn it into a spirit duplicated copy and hand it out to a class. I never met that teacher. It's just a legend in Sault Ste. Marie. So it was almost impossible to share anything with the students in that way. When the photocopier came, we went through our paper budget the first month. We were done. Everybody was so excited, we were done, except for the crazy teacher who just took a blank stack of paper to her classroom and had her students make up their own books, which we didn't quite understand. She didn't have to get in line with her coffee cup on the photocopier. She just came in, took a stack, and went. Ruth Madden, very wonderful teacher. So this idea then that we could copy things was liberating. And I remember the first newspaper articles I was able to share with my students. The first poems of Margaret Atwood I was able to introduce into my class because of the photocopier. And there was a kind of an outlaw, Wild West sensibility that we never gave any thought to intellectual property around. And then things started to change. And copywriting got organized in the 80s. And Access Copyright went through many different names, but it was an agency that was going to collect and has agreements with all of the ministries of education and provinces, and very controversial ones right now with post-secondary educational institutions. Has University of Victoria signed its agreement? Yes? Okay, so Simon Fraser University has refused, and UBC was actually one of the earliest to refuse to sign that agreement, and I'd be very happy to talk about the sensibility of that. But the important principle here is that education ran into intellectual property, and it became an issue. And it still is an issue. And what we share with our students is still a point of controversy around access copyright. And even though its concern is to make sure that Canadian authors and Canadian publishers survive against the onslaught of American influences, is important, I want to deal with the principle and what changed this summer in the Supreme Court case. So Judge Abella heard, and the Supreme Court, she wrote the deciding decision, though. This is Alberta versus the Canadian Copyright Licensing Agency, otherwise known as Access Copyright. And in that decision, the province of Alberta was sued by Access Copyright for violation, for infringement. And for the first time, we had a Supreme Court decision that said what the teachers were doing was fair dealing. We had a decision that said when a teacher and a student are engaged in a classroom setting, actively involved in learning, it counts as private study and research. It is not an exception to fair dealing. It is fair dealing in this country to learn in that setting. And this, for me, was a major statement. This, for me, had not been clear. This, for me, is the basis at the post-secondary level for all of the course packs and the 17 cents a page that is typically charged for intellectual property rights, although the price differs, obviously, from different publishers and different settings. So this idea that the court saw the importance of our contribution as educators to the greater good, for the encouragement of learning, for the progress of the useful sciences and arts, was an important decision. And part of that importance is the change that I referred to and didn't follow up on in terms of fair dealing in Canada. So with that decision this summer, and with the institution of a new copyright law in Canada, fair dealing has achieved a new level. What happened with the new copyright law is that two phrases were added to the exceptions to infringement. And the first of those, in Canada, was education. So before this, private study and research had been mentioned, but education per se had not. So one of the grounds for saying that we have fair dealing underway is education. The second one is parody and satire. Why it took Canada until 2012 to grant what the rest of the world had been granting for ages, to what had been so important to the National Lampoon and Saturday Night Live and a million other television programs in the United States or organizations in the United States. Finally, in 2012, Canada says a parody is legitimate. Weird Al Yankovic can come and perform in Canada without fears. Although Weird Al always got permission, even though he would have been in any court I would have been judge at, won the case. Do you know who Weird Al is? Okay, good. Just doing an age check, sorry. So, if we have this changing climate in Canada, a recognition by the Supreme Court of Canada, not known as the most progressive, cutting-edge institution in the world, to be fair, why not the faculty at the University of Victoria joining in, catching up, beginning to say that intellectual property is something I deal with in every classroom without mentioning it. It's something that's on every syllabus I produce. It is something that every student is engaged in. There must be opportunities to talk to our students about intellectual property rights, to raise their expectations that more of what the university does, more of what education is about, more of that whole realm of learning that should be part of a public good. Now, what those actual lessons, what we would want to teach, how we would begin to go about this. Let me give you one or two very practical examples to bring it home. And because you signed that agreement with Access Copyright, this will be a little complicated. But I'll give you a background and I'll put to you the challenge. Let me not lose track of the time here. To put to you the challenge of how we go about this. We did a study at Stanford and Queen's University. Queen's University and Stanford, we gathered all of the course books we could find from students. We gave them ice cream, we borrowed it for 24 hours, and we did a check on their course books. How much of the course book that the students have purchased, course readers, excuse me, or course packs, what do you call them? Course packs here? Okay, oh, nifty. Course reader actually on Google wins more uses. So the course packs, we did a test to see how many of these are freely available in the library. Now we did the test pajama ready. I don't mean you have to go to the library and photocopy them. I mean still in your pajamas in the dorm, can I get access to these articles? Okay, how many of these articles are already freely available to students in a way that should be as convenient as anything, the course packs? What are you thinking? There were some that were 90%. Engineering, 40% overall, because the humanities made it very tough. All the book chapters, not available. 40% of the material the students had already paid for with their tuition, and their parents had paid for with their tax-paying contributions to higher education. 40% the students were paying, and I actually do get a check from Access Copyright. I don't want to seem too much of a hypocrite to you. Sometimes well into 3 figures. That's kind of unseemly. It's not every time. So this idea then, I want you to consider the pedagogical consequences of this. Not only are these students paying 40% more, they're learning nothing about where the article they're reading lives and breathes and is cited and is critiqued and is supported. They're learning nothing about how these articles are published in journals with articles that contradict them, with articles that extend and supplement them. They're learning only to turn the pages of the course reader. And as if that wasn't too much, the articles are in the order in which they're taught. The students told us that was like the greatest thing. I said, like alphabet? No. Week 3. Just turn in 3 papers and you're there. That's only one aspect. They learn nothing about the intellectual property regime by which the professors sign over the copyright to their work that was paid for by taxpayers. Even at Stanford University, a private institution that is tax exempt. It is tax exempt not only in terms of its tuition that it receives as revenue, but on every donation that it receives, on every dollar it makes on those donations. It's tax exempt only because of its contribution, what's been my favorite phrase today, to the public good. It is entirely dependent on establishing that. So these students have no sense of this economy by which knowledge operates. And you wonder why this provincial government, this federal government, does not support higher education in the humanities and social sciences to a greater degree? Because every student we graduate from UVic, from UBC, from Simon Fraser University, from Stanford University, every student we graduate has no idea at the undergraduate level of this economy. Not only for the economic world they're going into, whether it's in finance, whether it's in medicine, whether it's in law, whether it's in any of the principal areas, or professional areas, education. For the very education they receive, they have no concept. Let me go a little further with this in terms of what the students don't learn. What the students don't learn is that 40% of those articles are not all in the library. Their library cannot subscribe to everything. Some of those 40%, some of the articles in that 40% that are available freely are online in an open access environment. And the students learn nothing about that. Because what happens when they graduate from the University of Victoria? One, no course packs. In the life to come, your graduates will have no course packs. Now, of course, they will treasure. They will always have by their bedside the course pack that you made them buy, I know that for a fact. But they will not only have no course packs, they will have no library access. Not only will they have no library access, they will have no awareness of how this knowledge circulates, and the 23% of it, when they graduate, it will be 25% of it, maybe 28% of it, maybe 50% of it is freely available for them to draw on. So if we just stopped using the course pack, or reduced the course pack by 40% and said, 40% of your readings this quarter are available in the library. What? You immediately see the students reaching for their schedules to see what courses are available at the same time. And then you say, but I provided a bibliographic entry for them. They look up, they see if there's a hyperlink there, they just have to click on, and there's no hyperlink because I want you to learn how to navigate the library, because I think that's part of my responsibility. And 5 of these articles are available online, freely. And if there's anyone still left in your class, when you finish, we have a terrible shopping week at Stanford, 2 weeks, where students, literally the term is shopping. They come in with bags. And so the shift in students is remarkable, far more so than I ever experienced at UBC. But at any rate, this idea then that we could begin to see intellectual property as a pedagogical opportunity. We could begin to equip our students to leave this university still engaged intellectually, still contributing to the very expectations that this knowledge will be freely available, seems to me absolutely critical. And that when a Supreme Court decision is made in this regard, our students and our faculty should be paying attention and should be saying that this is something that is important and that we need to see a consistency in Supreme Court decisions and legislation, that we need to see an increasing growth in the amount of work that we do that is part of a public domain, with all of the attribution rights protected, all of the peer review maintained. Now, if you ask me how are we going to finance that, if you want me to conclude on the financial question of how can we have all of this research freely circulating and still pay all of the publishers, still make sure that the shareholder value of the corporate publishers is protected, I can give you a very simple, not glib, but simple short answer. And it is, there is already enough money on the table to do that. In the field of STEM, in the field of science, technology, engineering, and medicine, the figure is $6 billion a year is spent on subscriptions to journals. If this library and all of the libraries said, we'll continue to pay that $6 billion. Only there's no benefit for us in keeping it locked up. There's no benefit for us saying to Willinsky he can't put research in the Vancouver Sun. There's no benefit for us from keeping our communities from appreciating and getting value from this research. Our legislators, our policymakers, am I pointing in the right direction? There's no value from restricting or excluding by saying we've got this information and the Island University doesn't have it, or UBC doesn't. There's no value in that. And so we could still finance the same publishing system we have today and just say we want everyone to have this. If this is what it costs, fine. I don't actually think it is. But if this is what it costs right now, fine. Let's begin to share it. So let me leave you with this responsibility. Let me leave you with this sense of opportunity, educational opportunity, pedagogical opportunity. Let me ask you, not this quarter, this term, semester, you're way too busy this term, but January, next quarter, introduce once some aspect of the intellectual property that's involved in your work with students. In 2013, think about the opportunity you have to share one or two of your publications on an open access basis because of the publisher's agreement, because of an open access journal that you decided to publish in. And then the world will change in a way that I think will increase the educational quality of everybody's life. Thank you very much. There aren't any questions. No, just kidding. What, do we have time for questions or not?
Sure, yeah, of course.
I'm Hausi Müller, Associate in Research Faculty of Engineering. So I pretty much agree with everything you said, except for my taste, you mentioned quality, not enough.
Okay.
So before everybody gets out there and makes all these papers you produce, put in public access journals, it's not that easy. Right now we are under complete attack from open access journal from China and from India. I'm in charge of IEEE Technical Council on Software Engineering, and yes, that's one of these associations that hold a lot of copyrights, right?
Yes.
And that gets in trouble if you think this way. And what you're saying is that there's a lot of money on the table. It's not true anymore. Absolutely not true anymore.
Okay.
Associations like ACM and IEEE go bankrupt right now because the libraries don't pay the fees anymore. So, and the low quality papers make it into these open access journals everywhere. There are some great open access journals, very high quality, but by and large, open access journals are lower quality than the journals you actually pay for. And that is a really big problem because that's the only thing we've got, quality, right, in academia.
So,
and if you're under attack from these guys, they will win eventually. So we have to make sure that the quality is not compromised by any of these things. You know, I'm all for learning, and that's great, and I support that 100%, right? But the quality has to come with it.
can I, so are you saying that the $6 billion figure I'm using is untrue?
Absolutely.
Well, I'm happy to present it to you. Can I?
So if you take IEEE, for example, right?
Yes.
IEEE, it's one of the largest organizations, has a huge digital library for all of science and engineering, right? The revenues of IEEE has gone dramatically. I don't know the exact figure right now, but like 75%, because the printed journals are not going to individual subscribers anymore. They get all access through libraries, all digitally, and the libraries, the subscription of libraries is basically the same as it was 10 years ago, right? But they lost all the subscription what the we have what the individuals paid in the past.
All right. First of all, I don't accept you standing up and telling me that my figure's not true. Okay. This is from Mark Ware, the editors of the Science and Technology Medical Journals (STM) Association in the UK. There are predatory journals. There are poor quality open access journals. It's absolutely true. And I would say they're in print. There are many poor quality journals. Let me just defend the open access question. And IEEE is an important organization and provides a support not just for journals, but for students and for scholarships. And this is not an attack on IEEE. But on the quality question, the open access element should be neutral. That is, whether it's peer-reviewed or not is the critical quality issue. And I hope you heard me say that peer review is an important part of this. The highest ranked, the highest cited journal in biology is the Public Library of Science Biology Journal, an open access journal that has never been printed and is probably in its 8th year and has already risen to that level. And so the quality issue is an important one. And it's true that I did not stress it as sufficiently in terms of your eyes, by all means. But it is not one that should stand in the way of the sharing of this knowledge. And so if the subscription levels have gone down for IEEE, if the ability for IEEE to raise funds is seen to be an important issue, there's nothing in what I'm saying that is contradictory to that. That all of the revenue that IEEE and other associations are making, I think is legitimate. I can't prevent the subscriptions of individual subscribers going down because there are just so many journals now that people want to pay attention to that the article has become the critical unit. But I can assure you that this is not an assault on IEEE. There are a group of journals coming out of India is actually one of the sources. There are probably 20 or 30 publishers who think they can take advantage of open access by charging fees for their article processing. And I think those are a concern. And there is a website on predatory publishers that lists these. And I think we would be well advised in terms of graduate students to alert them to this. But again, we have always thought about the quality of our journals that we publish in. And one of the things we learn in our fields are what are the quality journals and what journals are recognized and cited. And so that the issue that we should not share our work publicly because it threatens the quality of our work, I think is a specious argument. And I'm very happy to share with you the $6 billion figure, the source of that. And I'm happy to talk to you about how IEEE could be the first association to work with the Association of Research Libraries and the Canadian Association of Research Libraries to ensure that its revenue for publishing is protected and that it can continue to do the high quality work that it does in terms of that publication. For too long, the associations have used the journals, the same market economy that the commercial publishers use, to raise money to support the organization. And I think that's an important decision that needs to be rethought, but not thrown out. The idea that we would restrict our membership's circulation, that we would restrict the number of citations that our members receive from work published in the association journal should be restricted in order to raise money to support the association committed to the interests of the members is something that needs to be discussed. And if there's another way to guarantee that revenue while increasing the readership for our members' work, I think that should be explored. Are there other questions or comments? Yes, it's going to be a reach. Oh, so I don't lose my stage presence. Okay.
Thank you very much for your inspiring talk. Very recently, we've been very privileged in Canada to have the Canadian Research Knowledge Network arrange subscriptions on behalf of academia. Recently, the American Chemical Society, for which we've had all of their journal subscriptions, has changed their pricing model. It may or may not be related to the fact that their individual subscriptions are going down, so they want to go from a static subscription model for academia to a per-use model, which maybe perhaps would help them fund them. CRKN is refusing to play that game because it doesn't provide sustainable, predictable pricing for any of its members. So this is a case where all of these, I mean, these are licensed journals, they're not open access, so it's not an open access model, but this is a case where in fact academia is not willing to work with the publisher to figure out how they can sustain their publishing adventure. Now this is a society publisher, maybe not the Elsevier. So could you speak to what's happening behind the scenes here? Because I don't totally understand what all the issues are and how they fit into what this most inspiring, important message that you've just given to us, which I really think could be a TED Talk.
I can only talk in idealisms and hopes and aspirations. I can't talk about the behind the scenes. CRKN, which I always thought would be a great country radio station, but the Canadian Research Knowledge Alliance, Knowledge Network, is an amazing consortia of institutions across this country, of libraries, giving it purchasing power, giving it a voice as an entire nation of libraries. And this has not been so instrumental for University of Victoria, but absolutely crucial for Algoma University, where my first degree is from. Because the small universities all of a sudden, for the first time, had the ISI Web of Science. The small universities, for the first time, had access to databases like EBBO and others that they didn't have before. Absolutely crucial. What I want to suggest, and what I was suggesting before in terms of IEEE, is that we need to think past this kind of adversary, vendor-consumer relationship. That the American Chemical Association and IEEE are academic, IEEE is a professional as well, but an academic and professional association that has the same interests, is made up of the same people who belong to the libraries. And the idea that we have this very strange economy of faculty members turning over their copyrights so the libraries can buy it back is one that I'm hoping that an organization like CRKN that represents such an enormous body of libraries, including an entire geographical political unit, could begin to explore and think with any one association to start with what it would mean to enter into a cooperative relationship, would enter into an association that said, we are the same people. And that with a nod to Tommy Douglas and the great prairies of this country where cooperatives were so crucial for establishing market and global marketing, we could begin to think about sitting down and saying, could we even save money? Could we guarantee the revenue of the associations that's so important for their functioning? And by cutting out the middle people, by reducing the churn factor of having to sell and reestablish contracts, and arrive at some support as the libraries could provide in terms of hosting journals, in terms of indexing services and other kinds of things that libraries are very good at, could we begin to work together to fund the association, but to greatly amplify, to greatly increase the ability of this knowledge of its members, whether it's the American Chemical Association or the IEEE, its members to circulate their ideas and to see those ideas contribute to the encouragement of learning, to contribute to the progress of the useful sciences, which is so IEEE and the American Chemical Association, both somewhat complicated by being professional and scholarly associations, these two that we've talked about. So I'm not ready to give you a particular prescription or a particular program of reform. I'm asking you as members of an academic association, or you as members of faculty, to begin to think across, to begin to take the intellectual property issues so at stake, that so give our work value, that so recognize our work as legally constituted and economically constituted, and say, is this the best possible way for us to be members of this society and to contribute to it?
I'm sorry, we're actually a few minutes over, 15 minutes over, so thank you, John.
Okay, I'm ready to pay for extra time on the room.
Yeah.
No, okay.
I'd like to...
So I'm happy to talk to them as we leave.
Okay, I'll just hand it over to Joe to say thank you.
On behalf of the Learning and Teaching Center, I want to thank that. That was a wonderful talk. I'm here for Teresa Dawson, who wasn't able to make it, but one of the things you said earlier, John, was that in a previous talk, every lap had a top on it, and I wrote that down. I want you to know I copied that down.
It's copyrighted.
It's copyrighted. And today I think every top in the room has an idea in it, and it's about pedagogical opportunities that are available. And I think you've made you've changed the way I look at this, and I hope that it's reflected in the rest of the room. So I want to say thank you from the Learning and Teaching Center.